Thought Reflection 0422-26. A Glimpse Beyond Time. This thought reflection, this presentation, is more personal than anything I have shared so far. It comes from brushing up against something I cannot fully explain, something that felt vast, humbling, and quietly familiar. I don't claim to understand it. I only know that it changed the way I see, and what follows is my attempt to share that. There came a moment in my journey when something shifted, not outwardly, but entirely within how I experienced everything. It was subtle, almost impossible to point to in real time, yet unmistakable once it happened. One moment I was in the familiar flow of thought, of ordinary awareness, and then without warning, I was somewhere else. Not somewhere physical, not a different place, but a different way of being within the same place. Nothing outside of me had changed, yet everything felt different. The moment itself changed. The way I processed it changed. What I was seeing was no longer what I normally saw, and what I was feeling was not what I normally felt. It felt old. It felt ancient. It felt remembered. There was a deep recognition, not intellectual, but something I felt in my chest, like a quiet shock of familiarity. How could I have forgotten this? I have been here before, not once, but many times. And yet each time it returned, it felt like rediscovering something I had always known but could never quite hold on to. It felt solid. It felt real in a way that made everything else seem thinner by comparison, more vivid, more complete. And even as I was in it, there was a knowing that I was only touching a fraction of what it actually was. But what stood out most was the absence of distortion. There was no noise, no extra movement in my head. It was as if the interference had dropped away completely, like a filter I didn't know existed had suddenly been removed. I wasn't jammed up inside my own thinking. I wasn't pulled in 100 directions at once. I was clear, open, free in a way that is difficult to describe until you feel it for yourself. And in that clarity, something else was present. I cannot say I heard music, not in the way we normally understand it, but there was something like it woven into the experience, a kind of underlying harmony, a continuous, beautiful tone that seemed to be part of everything I was perceiving. I cannot recall it clearly now, only traces of it remain, like the faint memory of a song that once moved you deeply but cannot be replayed in the same way again. But I know it was there. There was also a vastness I had no idea I contained. In ordinary life, it feels like my capacity is limited, like a system running at full load, constantly processing, constantly buffering, never fully clear. But in that state, there was no sense of limitation. It was as if there was no ceiling, no edge, no restriction. There was only openness, space to move, space to explore. And yet I never seemed to get far because eventually it would begin to fade. And when it did, it faded slowly. Not abruptly, but gently, like a tide pulling back. There is an afterglow that remains, a kind of internal warmth, a subtle rush that carries the echo of what was just there. And with it comes a feeling that is hard to ignore. What did I just experience? And alongside that, a quiet sense of loss. Not dramatic, but undeniable. As if something slipped away. Not because it was taken, but because I could not quite remain where it was. Even after it fades, something stays with me. A memory, but not a complete one. I can remember that I experienced it. I can remember how powerful it felt, but I cannot recreate it. The feeling itself is gone. All that remains is an imprint, a trace, something that points back to it but cannot fully contain it. And yet that is enough to know it was real. What also became clear was how different everything felt while I was there. The weight I normally carry was gone. The constant background pressure, the subtle questions, the micro concerns that quietly drive stress and anxiety, they simply were not present. I didn't realize how much they were there until they were gone. And without them, everything was lighter. There was no urgency, no pressure, no internal friction. I could move freely without resistance. I was simply there, present without the weight of everything I usually carry. As I followed this thread, not by chasing it, but by learning not to interfere with it, I began to see that the process itself was the access point. Not a grand technique, not a literal doorway, but an idea, a way of describing how one enters into a different mode of perception. To notice the noise without feeding it. To allow the mind to quiet without forcing it. To recognize what remains when the usual patterns loosen their grip. It was not about stopping thought entirely, but about no longer trying to find anything through thought. In fact, it was the opposite of what I had always assumed. The moment I stopped using thought to search for it, something else began to show itself. For a time, I found myself returning to the experience with a quiet curiosity. Not because I was confused, but because of the way it felt. The questions that came were not driven by doubt, but by wonder. What is this? Why does it feel so important? Why does it feel so right? But eventually I began to see that even those questions were not the center of it. It did not matter where it came from or why it returned. The more important question, the only question that held weight, was how to recognize the access point and how to step into it again. Not by force, but by awareness. Looking back along the timeline of my life, I began to sense a strange coherence. The restless searching, the endless circling of ideas, the periods of confusion and intensity, all of it seemed to have played a role in reshaping how I saw. Not as a rigid design, but as a pattern that, when viewed from this new vantage point, carried a kind of internal logic. It was as if I had been moving through a curriculum I never consciously enrolled in, one that slowly dismantled my assumptions and expanded my capacity to perceive. The book I had begun to write, the videos I had created, the thoughts I had struggled to express, they were not merely outputs, but part of the process itself, ways of translating and stabilizing what I was encountering. I started to understand that perception was not passive. It shaped everything. The same world, the same people, the same events, yet experienced through a different lens, became something else entirely. Distortion was not only within me, it moved between people, echoing and amplifying in groups, shaping the shared reality we inhabited. And if distortion could spread, then so could clarity. There were moments when the scale of what I was touching felt almost incomprehensible. My mind, still rooted in linear thinking, would attempt to stretch outward, imagining possibilities in every direction. But I began to see that this expansion was not the point. The point was the entry point itself, the subtle shift that allowed me to step out of the noise and into something quieter, deeper, and more coherent. Not by thinking my way into it, but by no longer trying to think my way into it at all. And from that place, a quiet certainty emerged. There was something more. Not something distant, but something already here, waiting beneath the noise. Something that could be touched again through attention and intention, through a willingness to remain open without forcing what comes next. I do not claim to understand what lies beyond that threshold. I only know that the entry is real, that I have touched it, and that my life has already begun to reorganize around that recognition. And so my journey shifts once more, from gathering ideas to cultivating clarity, not to reach an end, but to continue stepping gently and attentively through that access point into a way of being that has always been available, waiting beneath the noise, patient and unchanged. Haggis, my esoteric journey.